Good evening, and welcome to St. John's Cathedral. If you are not one of our members, we're especially glad to have you here. And we're especially glad to have you here if you are a member of one of the other Abrahamic faiths. Part of my joy in the time that I've been here as the interim dean is to interact with people in the parish and in the community, the wider community, who have found great meaning in peaceful and purposeful conversations with people of other faiths to try to foster understanding and to live together in peace and to worship our Creator in our different ways, but acknowledging that we are all the children of one Creator. Especially, St. John's has been involved for a long time in the Abrahamic Initiative, and many of you who are here tonight are active participants in that work. Episcopalians are typically people who are capable of living with a certain level of a church that has its roots in the Elizabethan settlement. That is the settlement between fighting factions of Christians in England fostered by Queen Elizabeth I, and we sometimes call it the Via Media, or the middle way. So seeking that common understanding is a part of the fabric of our heritage and who we are. Recently, someone said about us Episcopalians and Anglicans that we can love our religion without hating yours. I thought that kind of summed it up in a neat little package, because we do have a lot of that kind of rhetoric in our world today, dividing people. So your presence here tonight suggests that you too have that spirit of reconciliation, and that you hope for a day when people can truly live together in peace and respect and understand one another, even though there are differences. So welcome. Tonight we're here to listen to our guest speaker, a Turkish author and journalist, Mustafa Akyol. And he comes to us as an author and as a journalist in the fall of 2013. A Turkish citizen, he studied political science and history at Bogazici University, teaches politics, or has taught politics, both in Istanbul and other places. He's doing a lot of seminars now. And in January, he and his wife, Riada, and their son moved to Wellesley, Massachusetts. And he comes to us here in Denver from that location. And he told us at dinner tonight that he and Riada are expecting a second child in August. And so those of us who've had that experience know that it's a remarkable time in a family's life. So one of his books, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, is an argument for Islamic liberalism. It was published in the United States in 2011. And it is on sale out in the Memorial Hall, along with the book we're going to hear more about tonight, The Islamic Jesus. So Mustafa will talk to us for a while, and then there will be an opportunity for questions. So Mustafa, welcome to Denver, and welcome to St. John's Cathedral.
Thank you so much for this very warm welcome. And thanks, Father Ron Pogue, for this very generous introduction. And yes, we are excited about a second baby, and I know life will be difficult after that even more, but I still look forward to that. I truly see it as an honor to be here. I'm very humbled to be able to speak at a cathedral, at a Christian cathedral as a Muslim. So I really appreciate this welcome. And we should also thank our good friend Becky Strout, who's not with us tonight, but she has really taken a great role in organizing this event and actually introducing me with Father Ron Pogue. As you learned, I'm from Turkey, Istanbul, whose politics is not great these days, but I'm not going to speak about that tonight. But I'm from Istanbul, Turkey. That's my hometown, and I lived most of my life in Istanbul. But the U.S. has become my second home over the years, because I traveled to the U.S. dozens of times and came for fellowships and travels and conferences, coast to coast. I've seen a lot of parts of your beautiful country. And I'm an observer when I travel, and to tell my grandparents, hopefully in the future. And therefore, I want to begin tonight with a story of mine from actually the very first trip I had to the United States 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I was a younger man, mid-20s, and I was excited to see America, the land of Rocky Balboa for me. And I came on a summer vacation to visit a friend of mine who had already moved to the US, and he showed me places. He took me around from California to New York. I spent 3 weeks with him, and I loved everything I saw, and I was very excited. One morning, we were really hungry, and he said, "Let's have breakfast." I said, "Okay, let's have breakfast." And he said, "Let's go to McDonald's." I said, "Will we eat burgers for breakfast?" He said, No, McDonald's has breakfast." I said, "Okay, let me see what that is." So we went in, and he bought me a breakfast menu, and he gave me the menu and the plate, and that was the first time in my life that I saw pancakes. We didn't have pancakes in Turkey in the 90s. So he showed me how to put the syrup and the butter, and it sucked. This is the most delicious thing I ever had in my life. I instantly fell in love with pancakes. But I had a misunderstanding. I was thinking that pancakes are an exclusive McDonald's product. So therefore, I went back to Turkey. I came to US next summer holiday, and I was willing to eat pancakes, and I'm looking around for a McDonald's, right? It went on for a few days. I was looking for a McDonald's before 10:30 a.m. because I figured out they'd change into lunch menu at 10:30. And it went on for a few days, and it was, I think, the third day, and I was walking in Manhattan, and I saw a restaurant, a non-McDonald's restaurant, which said, "We serve pancakes." I said, they stole it from McDonald's. It took a while to realize that pancakes are a larger phenomenon, than McDonald's, and that you can have them probably everywhere. And years later, I took a lesson from that story, and the lesson was that a foreign culture might be a little confusing when you meet it for the first time. And you can misunderstand some of its peculiarities. And, if you misunderstand the cuisine of a different culture, okay, that's not a big problem. You'll figure out. Understand if you have some misperceptions about the culture, the history, the politics, the religion of a different society, of a whole different civilization, sometimes that is a bigger gap to fill. And as someone who has been in the media, give or take, in the past 2 decades, I think that at this day and age in world history, in 21st century, we are very prone to misunderstanding different cultures, precisely because of the media, which actually gives us a lot of information about different cultures. You open your breaking news, right? And you get, TVs, and you get breaking news from all corners of the world. Like it's kidnapping, assassination, bombings, and massacres. But you hear all the negative stuff out there. Because what makes the news is shocking, disturbing, appalling things, bad things. Normal people, decent people, moderate people, they don't make the news. So they don't make the headlines. They don't make the breaking news, evening news. So we are in this doom dynamic, and I think that is partly why after 9/11, that horrific day in which 3,000 Americans were ruthlessly killed by a bunch of terrorists who supposedly act in the name of my faith, Americans highlighted these extremists in the Muslim world, which are there, which are a problem and a threat to Americans, shaped the image of Islam in the minds of some Westerners. And I think that that's a mistake to be careful about. But I'll tell you, the same dynamic has been working on our side as well. In other words, people from the Middle East, the rhetoric they hear from the West are generally not the most likable, moderate, open-minded rhetoric. They hear the most disturbing and shocking things. I'll give you an example. In 2012, I made a little research to find out which American Christian leader, a pastor or a priest, appeared most frequently in the Turkish media, therefore shaped the image of Christians, in the Turkish public consciousness. The research, which I will admit was simple and short. It was a Google search, which took 7 seconds. I just typed the Turkish word for pastor in. It turned out that the most frequently appearing figure in the Turkish media as a Christian leader was this gentleman in Florida who wanted to burn a copy of the Quran. And I know people have constitutional rights, but you can use them respectfully or sometimes aggressively or disrespectfully. He used them in a disrespectful way. But most importantly, other Christian leaders, mainstream Christian leaders, disagreed with him. They said, no, you shouldn't do this. But they didn't make the news. It was not Christians. It was just a small denomination in the middle of nowhere in Florida, with all the respect to Florida, to all the places within there as well. So we are in this doom dynamic, and we see the disturbing radical elements there, and they shape an image about the other sides. Therefore, I travel the world trying to say, no, the other side is not that bad, trying to build bridges. I find myself sometimes saying that. But politics is one thing. I also want to look deeper into the very core of our faiths that really has shaped us, shaped our values, our religions, our civilizations. I wanted to look, especially with my new book, not with Islamic extremism, but the Islamic Jesus, how the king of the Jews became a prophet of the Muslims. With this new book, I wanted to look into the theological issues and theological bridges, little noticed theological bridges between Islam and Christianity. And Judaism too, by the way, which is a part of the picture always, when you enter these two religions. So I'll try to share with you some thoughts and some observations from that book. First of all, let's just ask one simple question. What is Islam? And before even Islamic Jesus, what is Islam? Well, in a very small, tiny nutshell, Islam was a idolatrous society. In 7th century Arabia, Arabs were worshipping idols, war god, love god, agriculture god, in Kaaba, which was a pagan pantheon in the city of Mecca. And Prophet Muhammad came out and he said, he took a revelation from God, as we believe, and he said, these are all false God. There is only one God, and that is the God. La ilaha illallah, which means no God but the God. That's the message of Islam. And who was that the God? The God of Abraham. The Quran insists that this is the God of Abraham, and that God had given revelations to Moses and Noah and Jewish patriarchs and Abraham before, and now comes Prophet Muhammad. So it is the continuation of this Abrahamic monotheism. And therefore, as a latecomer in this monotheistic scene, Islam, on the one hand, appreciated and respected older monotheisms. On the other hand, it criticized aspects of those, and of course said this is the most mature version, that's why there is a new religion. But that appreciation of older monotheisms has been, in my view, not appreciated by Muslims enough. Because there grew this tendency to say, ultimately, we are the only righteous ones and everything is utter and falsehood. We humans have this dynamic tendency to make God only. This happens everywhere, and it has happened in Islam. But when you look carefully in the Quran, you see a powerful ecumenism right there in the very beginning. One verse, a very powerful Quranic verse, 548, it declares that if God willed, he would make all of us one community. but actually he willed to have us as different communities. We are given different scriptures so that we can compete with each other doing good. So religious pluralism is not a defiance of divine will, it's actually expression of divine will. It's right there in the Quran. Another verse in the Quran said that, which is still in the Quran. It says, anybody from the believers, Jews, Christians, and Sabians was a monotheistic group at the time. Any people among them who believe in God and the last day and have good deeds, they will be saved. They will go to heaven. It didn't say salvation is within the mosque only. It said people from other faiths can be saved as well. Some Muslims, actually don't want to hear this today. They say, oh, no, it is only if they convert to Islam. But actually it's right there in the Quran, that very ecumenistic belief. And I think it's time to rediscover that, especially at a time of so much bigotry in the world in the name of religion. Now, within this appreciation, actually the most prominent character in the whole Quran. You read the Quran, you learn more about Moses more than anybody else. So it's very important. But also Jesus is very important. There's an incredible respect shown to Jesus Christ in the Quran, and therefore in the whole Islamic tradition. But in what sense? Let's get into that a little bit. Actually, we should begin with not Jesus, but even his mother, Mary. Mary is such an interesting figure in Islam because throughout the whole Quran, she is the only woman mentioned by her name. There's even a chapter named Mary. There's even a verse which says, Mary is a woman above all other women. She's the highest female human being according to the Quran. One could expect Prophet Muhammad's mother to be that way, but no, it's Mary. And in the chapter Mary, and there's another chapter, Al Imran, which means the family of Imran, which is the family of Mary. So another chapter is actually related to her. We read how Mary gave birth to Jesus. First of all, we read in the Quran that she was this very pious Jewish woman, chaste. No man has ever touched her. She was a virgin. And one day, an angel comes, how can I have a son? No man has ever touched me. And the angel says, Gabriel, as we understand from the exegesis of the Quran at least, the angel says, God has willed a son, and God creates whatever he wills, so he just says be, and that becomes. So that blessed son will be created. And Mary gets pregnant with Jesus without a biological father. So the Quran strongly confirms virgin birth. And then Jesus comes to life and gets born. And Mary is accused by her people in the Quran about this fatherless child. How did you sire this child, Mary? And Jesus speaks according to the Quran. And it says, I am God's Messiah. God created me. And my mother is a chaste woman. So do not accuse her. So there is this very powerful teaching of Mary and Jesus in the Quran. I should say that one part of the story I told you, Jesus speaking from the cradle as a baby, might be unfamiliar to Christians in our audience, to Western Christians in our audience, because it's not in the New Testament, but it is in an Eastern gospel called the Infancy Gospel of Matthew, which didn't make its way into the New Testament, but it was used widely in the Christian Eastern churches. Not in the New Testament, but in an apocryphal gospel. So that is a story about Mary. And what about Jesus? How does Quran defines Jesus? First of all, the Quran repeatedly calls Jesus the Messiah. 11 times he's called the Messiah. He's called the prophet and the servant of God. His miracles are narrated. When you read the Quran, you learn that Jesus raised the dead, healed the sick, and he told people things that they didn't know. So he had these amazing miracles. We read in the Quran that Jesus had disciples, and disciples are shown as ideal believers that Muslims should emulate. They're shown great respect. The Quran even calls Jesus the Word of God. Kalimatullah. Now, that's a very powerful term if you know the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, and the world being with God and coming down to earth and becoming flesh to dwell among men. And that's why Christians were always curious, what does the Quran mean by word of God? And Muslim exegetes of the Quran have been puzzled. They had different views. They said the Quran, Jesus called the word of God because God created him with the word be. But a few other Muslim scholars said a revelation from God. He was not a normal human being. Everything he was doing was a manifestation of God's wisdom. So here you have a very interesting being, not about any other normal human being. So these are the amazing things the Quran says about Jesus. However, that's one part of the picture. The Quran also takes a critical stance towards some other aspects of the Christian faith about Jesus. One thing is that the Quran rejects the divinity of Jesus, insists on that very strongly. No, Jesus is not God, he's a servant of God. That's emphasized. The Quran also seems to oppose the doctrine of Trinity. In one verse, it appeals to Christians and it says, do not say three, it's one God. So the doctrine of Trinity is not accepted in Islamic tradition, as it's not accepted in the Jewish tradition as well. So there are these gaps, and therefore, when you look at the whole picture, the Quran seems to define a Jesus who's holy, who's sacred, who's the Word of God, but who's still not divine. Which, through my research, I realized actually sounds similar to certain strains in Christianity, those sects with lower Christologies. Because the nature of Jesus has been a big discussion among Christians from the very beginning. And the mainstream, of course, ultimately the third person of the Trinity, or second person of the Trinity, pardon me. But there were other Christian strains in early Christianity, which actually said, no, Jesus is not God. So they distanced themselves from the mainstream. Now, one thing in my book, one theme in my book is that there is really a curious resemblance in the texts and theologies of those non-Trinitarian Christian groups and the Quran. There are striking parallelisms, especially the strain in early Christianity called Jewish Christianity has texts and teachings that are very similar to Islam. And this has been noticed by actually some scholars and said, wow, what the Didache, which the Jewish Christian says is very similar to the Quran. It even, sentences are even similar. So how did this happen? And, well, the answer is in my book. You have to read it. But I'm just going to say this. There are strong parallelisms, and how do you interpret them depends partly where you're looking from. A Christian can easily say, well, some of our unorthodox teachings were borrowed by Muslims and Islam, and it influenced. That's how a Christian can see it, and I understand and respect that. A Muslim can say, well, our truth has been foretold by that we are somehow connected, that there are really interesting theological bridges between us. Besides those similarities between Jewish Christianity and Islam, as I tried to touch upon in the very beginning, there are some textual similarities between the Quran and some Eastern Gospels that didn't make their way into the New Testament. I already touched one of them. I'll give you another example. When you read the Quran, you read Jesus' miracles of Jesus. And some of them are familiar. He raised the dead, he healed the sick, you know these. The Quran also says, in a very interesting way, Jesus took a piece of clay, shaped it in the form of a bird, then breathed into it, and his breath made the clay bird a real bird, and the bird flew away. Now, when I tell this story to my Western Christian friends, I ask, are you familiar with this? They say, no, what is this? We've never heard this. Well, of course, because it's not in the New Testament. But it is in an other gospel that didn't make its way into the New Testament, called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Not the Gospel of Thomas, maybe you might have heard because it's a famous gospel, Gnostic tendencies, but the infancy Gospel of Thomas. And there are a series of infancy Gospels which was focused on the baby Jesus and his birth. You see this narrative. Jesus takes clay, makes it a sparrow. It defines it as a sparrow, not just a bird, but then the birds fly away. So it is the Quranic story. Again, how do you interpret these textual connections depends on your interpretation, but we are connected. In the book, I try to show these similarities, connections, and I also try to sometimes look into the gaps and try to see, well, maybe we can fill these gaps a little bit. Try to look at some alternative interpretations. And one of them is the part where I try to bring some perspective on the concept Son of God. Of course, in Christianity, Jesus is called the Son of God. That's very fundamental, truth in Christianity. If you ask Muslims, they will say, no. We can't call anybody like that. The term Son of God is not an accepted term in Muslim literature. And that's a gap between, Muslims and Christians. Jesus is called the Prophet of God, the Son of Mary. The Quran constantly calls him the Son of Mary, but not Son of God. And actually, there are a few verses in the Quran that even are very harshly criticize those people who call anybody Son of God. So this is kind of an unbridgeable gap. In Arabic, there are two words for son. One is walad, which is a biological son. The other one is ibn, which is a metaphorical son. In other words, if I have a walad, I have one, he's 2-year-old toddler, I must have had a wife, and we must have done something biological, which we did, to help him come to life. So you can't have a walad without a carnal, biological, sexual relationship. But you can adopt somebody, and that can be your ibn, that can be your metaphorical son. And when you look into the Quran, when you look at the Quranic verses that condemn those people who believe or who say God has a son, it is using the word walad, the biological sonship. And why is the case? Why was this the case? Well, look at the context of the Quran. Pagan Arabs, just like Greek idolaters, they believed in gods with sons, daughters, and wives, and families, and sexual affairs, and all that. It was like the Greek, pantheon, the Arab pantheon. The Quran is condemning that, actually. In one verse of the Quran, it says, God has no son nor a wife. Well, Christians don't. Here is a way for Muslims to look into the notion of Son of God without seeing it as necessarily heretical. Some Muslim scholars noticed this in medieval era. Ibn al-Razi, who is a great exegete of the Quran, he wrote about this, and he said, maybe Christians use this in a metaphorical sense, and maybe we can understand it as, Abraham was called a friend of God in Islam, or Prophet Muhammad is called a lover of God, which certainly doesn't mean anything, in a biological relationship. Of course, still, Muslims would have a distance on when it means the deification of Jesus, but at least a better Muslim approach, a deeper understanding of the term of Son of God can build some ground for some religious dialogue, interfaith dialogue. One more thing. Ask your Muslim friends typically about what Muslims think of crucifixion. And the common answer you'll get is that, well, we don't accept crucifixion. Muslims don't think Jesus was crucified, that Jesus was saved somehow, and crucifixion didn't exactly happen. I mean, somebody was crucified, but it was not Jesus. That is the common approach you can find in Islamic literature. That comes just from one verse in the Quran. And that verse is open to interpretation. I'll get into it in a second. But that verse in Medina, who apparently said a slander against Mary, and the Quran responds to them very critically, because the Quran is very insistent that Mary was chaste and very protective of Mary. And then these Jews apparently in Medina, they also said, we killed and crucified the Messiah, which is Jesus. And the Quran to them says, no, you didn't kill and crucify Messiah. It appeared to you as if it was the case. Appeared to you. So that term appearance has been, taken by Muslim exegetes, and they said the Quran is saying that Jesus was not crucified, so somebody else was crucified in place of Jesus. That's the common approach in Islamic literature. Some people have found a similarity with this interpretation and an early Christian heresy called Docetism, which also said Jesus wasn't crucified. It looked like that, so some people see a connection there. But I have a different explanation. When you look into the verse carefully, it says to Jews, a group of Jews obviously, not all Jews say that, but a certain group of Jews at the time, said, we killed and crucified Jesus. And the Quran says, no, you didn't kill and crucify Jesus. Is this historically true? Yes, of course, because Jews did not kill and crucify Jesus. The Romans did. The Quran is not saying nobody crucified Jesus. The Quran is saying Jews didn't crucify Jesus for Jewish communities in medieval Europe. So actually the Quran might be saving Jews from the blame of crucifying Jesus, which historically was not the case at all. It was the Romans who did that. So that is at least one way of looking into the Quran. In other words, there are different ways of approaching these texts in Islamic tradition about Christianity. And I'm not going to deny that divinity of Jesus will not be a matter of a doctrine that will be accepted by Muslims. But I think Muslims can, by looking into their tradition a bit more from new perspectives, can understand where Christians at least are coming from with certain theological concepts. And I think we need that bridge at this day and age. Now, in my book, I also have a final chapter, which is different from all of this. Because there I say, well, let's leave the theology about Jesus aside for a moment. Because the theology about Jesus is a complicated topic. Christians wrestled with each other throughout the centuries. And of course, Muslims take a lower Christology, so there are disputes there. But theology about Jesus is one thing, but the teachings of Jesus is another thing. And I'm in that chapter titled, What Jesus Can Teach Muslims Today, to see if his teachings are relevant to us Muslims in this day and age. And I'm saying, oh, it is very relevant. Why? I mean, that was the first time I read the New Testament 15 years ago. And I was struck by the way that Jesus criticized the Pharisees of his time. And this is not to paintbrush, all Pharisees into one basket. It was a nuanced situation about the Pharisees as well. But you see Jesus in first century Palestine criticizing some Jewish clerics, in particular the legalist Pharisees, for being obsessed about little details of the halakha, religious law, but forgetting the moral principles behind it. He's criticizing them to be legalists who forget the compassion, the love and all the values behind those religious injunctions. He's criticizing Jews to be too much attached to the halakha and be very rigid in implementing that and doing things like stoning women, based on suspicion, and calling them to, look deeper into their own tradition. Now, in the modern world today, 21st century, who is stoning women to death? A few, you can have that in Iran, Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth, because they follow the Sharia, which is Islam's version of the halakha. And they follow the Sharia very literally without trying to understand the moral purposes behind it and without bringing in a reform and a reinterpretation of that. Now, Jesus was, from the historical perspective, was a very powerful within Judaism at a time when Jews turned very rigid about their doctrine, called on them to understand the moral purposes of their faith and stop being, obsessed about the halakha. And I think today, that is exactly the problem we have in the Muslim world today. We have legalists who are obsessed about implementing the Sharia without considering what it means and what is the purposes behind it and what are the moral lessons behind it. Now, in Islam, actually, there is a tradition which says, let's look at the intentions behind Sharia, not the rulings. This is known as the Maqasid school in Islam, or the intention school. The scholars who thought this way, they thought that all Sharia is actually about protecting certain values and goals. One of them, Imam Shatibi in the 14th century, systematized the whole understanding of Sharia and said, all Sharia is about actually protecting 5 values, which are, if you look at protecting these values today, well, you can say, well, they're protected pretty well in Canada or Sweden or, in the US too. I mean, there's some issues growingly in the US, but in the US as well. And not in Saudi Arabia or Yemen or Iran. I mean, and if you look at the intentions, this basic goals of protecting life, religion, and values, and so on and so forth. So there is a reformist interpretation in Islam which looks at the intentions of law rather than the blind literalism. But this has not been discovered enough. And when I read Jesus, I found a powerful inspiration to walk on this path, to rediscover the meaning of Sharia. And who am I to say this? I mean, I'm not a religious scholar or anybody, so I'm not that important. But a scholar as important as Muhammad Abduh, who was a late 19th century Egyptian scholar who was very prominent and who actually initiated a more reformist tradition in Islamic thought, he wrote in the late 19th century in Egypt that Jesus shows us the way. Jesus criticized Jews for being literalists, and now we are the literalist ones. So we should look into our Sharia in the perspective of Jesus. Here you have that understanding, and it was implemented by somebody as powerful as, it was advocated by somebody as powerful as Muhammad Abduh. Look into the theological issues about Jesus, and we can learn and we can see the bridges and the gaps between us and Christianity. We Muslims will not worship Jesus because we are, strictly, monotheistic faith in that sense. I'm not saying Christianity isn't, but Islamic monotheism doesn't, allow the doctrine of incarnation. However, we don't have to worship Jesus, but we can still follow him. And I think, given the situation in the Muslim world, and given the wisdom that you see in the Gospels, and given all the Islamic tradition that actually appeals to Jesus, we can safely be Muslims and follow the teachings of Jesus. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now, floor is open. If you have questions, comments, protests, all are welcome. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The Quran doesn't, the question is, what does the Quran say about the resurrection of Jesus? The Quran doesn't directly address resurrection. There is no story of Jesus being, put on cross. However, the Quran says that the people who were trying to kill him, could not kill him. God saved him, and God took him to himself. So, therefore, there is a powerful tradition in Islamic literature that Jesus was taken up alive to God, and that he's still alive in a level with the same level with angels. And actually, in one verse, the Quran says, neither the Messiah nor the high angels would refrain from worshiping God. So the Messiah is with the high angels somewhere in some level of existence. So, the Quran doesn't tell the stories of Gethsemane. The Quran is not about the story of Jesus. That's what the Quran touches upon the story. But it says something about Jesus being taken up to God. And that has been interpreted as that God somehow, there has been an ascension of Jesus to God. And which also, therefore, brings the Muslim also belief that there will be a second coming of Jesus as well. In my book, I also have a chapter on this, the second coming, with a question mark. It is not explicit in the Quran, but in the Hadith, the saying of Prophet Muhammad, it's clearly stated that Jesus will come back to earth at some point to unite all monotheisms under one banner. Because seeing Jesus, everybody will follow his teaching. Of course, Muslims think it will be an Islamic, version of monotheism. So Christians will come to that part, and we will see what happens, if that happens literally. But there is this idea that Jesus will come back. There is even a belief that when Jesus comes back, he will live on earth and he will ultimately die naturally, and he will be buried next to Prophet Muhammad. And in Medina today, near Prophet Muhammad's tomb, there is an empty place for Jesus. One day he will come back and he will live and he will be buried there. So, and by the way, Ahmadiyya Muslims, that's another, color in Islam, let's say. There's a sect in Islam called Ahmadiyya. Some people think they're not Muslims at all. I don't think like that, except people when they say Muslims. They believe that Jesus survived the cross. He was crucified, but he survived the cross, and he secretly went to India, to Kashmir, and lived there and died there. Kashmir is where they come from, by the way. They thought it's an important place that Jesus should have come. And there's a tomb of Jesus in Kashmir today, still visited and respected by Muslims. So there are different narratives in Islam, and some Muslims deny the whole second coming idea. Belief in Islam is there. Yes, Jesus was taken up to God alive. He's still alive, and he will come back to earth, and that will be like a cosmic event and will change world and everything. Thank you. It's in the 8th chapter of my book, Islam. It's out there for sale if you're interested. Just saying. Yes, ma'am.
In your book, you had some verses from the Quran that showed God, the language for God is us and we. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Why in the Quran God calls himself we, us? Well, that's an Arabic linguistic expression of magnanimity. In the Quran, sometimes when God speaks in the Quran, and by the way, the Quran is a interesting book in the sense that you hear directly God's words. It's not like the New Testament where, acts of Jesus are reported by other people. It's what it can be compared to. Some parts of the Old Testament are maybe similar, but you hear God speaking, and God sometimes say, I created you, or I did this. More often, though, he says we. And by we, some people thought, is it like a plurality there? I don't think so. I think it's an Arabic linguistic expression of magnanimity. And you actually see that in Muslim culture. The important can say, we did this. Our political leader says, we think like that. We meaning that person, but he's a great person in that sense. So it's a kind of a magnanimity expression. But yes, God sometimes uses the word, the noun we, rather than I in the Quran. And is there a theological basis for that? I think it's more linguistic than that. Was that your question? Okay. Thank you for the question. Yes, sir. I don't know. What would he say? Of course, he's a cleric from Turkey and a controversial one, not because of his ideas, but because of the organization he leads and got into, if you ask me, some power struggles in Turkey, and what was a big mistake on their behalf. I don't know what would he think, honestly. But in my book, I quoted Said Nursi, which is another Turkish scholar that I have actually great respect for. And Said Nursi was a scholar who passed in 1960. He was of Kurdish origin. And he wrote intensely, actually, about these issues, end of the world. And he has shown great respect for Jesus. And in Said Nursi's understanding, the second coming of Jesus would be realized when Muslims against communism, it was the issue in his time, in the 60s, 50s, and he died in 1960. So godlessness, atheism. So he saw that faith is being challenged. So he thought that Christians and Muslims can build a commonality together to defend faith and for the betterment of the world. So in Turkey and elsewhere, there are these kind of scholars who thought Christians are not our enemies. There are a lot of commonalities, and actually we have so many things in common against maybe some other groups. I'm not saying this to denigrate atheists or show them as the enemy or something, but in this Turkey in 50s, communism, Soviet Union, Soviet occupation was a big fear. And there was a feeling that, oh, Christians are our allies. They're not like the Soviets. And so Said Nursi has been under the influence of that. And he wrote about the coming of Jesus as a metaphor for a common understanding in monotheism. Muhammad Abduh, the scholar I quoted, actually refers to the coming of Jesus idea as a metaphor for Muslims to understanding the Sharia in a non-literalist way. He says that will be the coming of Jesus to us when we look into Sharia as he look into the halakha, the Jewish law. So here you have interesting perspectives there. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
And as you've given this presentation to different groups, so different groups of Christians, Muslims, what kind of response are you getting? What kind of open reception on both sides?
Thank you. Well, my book is new. It's been 3 months, but in the past 3 months, I've been able to speak to big communities from Muslim and Christian side as well. So I've been able to speak twice to Muslim communities about this in the U.S. and publish in the U.S. the book is. So I'll be speaking about this in Malaysia and other parts of the world soon too. But I got pretty positive responses. I mean, first of all, no Muslim can criticize me for respecting Jesus or writing a book about Jesus in Islam. I mean, no Muslim can go against Jesus. And respect for Jesus is, if you don't respect Jesus, you're not a Muslim. I mean, it's in the Quran. So there's no problem about that. On some issues, I am just pushing Muslim, mainstream opinion to look a bit more open-minded to Christian concepts. And on those, I mean, Muslims, my fellow Muslims, when they listen to me, they say, interesting, well, we can think like that too. So I've seen that response. I mean, the whole Son of God discussion, for example. I tried to explain, well, the Quran condemns something called Son of God, but it's not maybe exactly what Christians believe. It's more of a pagan deity with, a child and family and that sort of thing. I mean, I've seen positive, I got positive response. Of course, I didn't speak to the Taliban or I'm more kind of willing to engage in a positive dialogue, which is the majority, of course, in most cases. I've also said that I think the most shocking thing or novel thing I'm saying from a Muslim perspective in the book is the chapter, What Jesus Can Teach Muslims Today. Because Muslims respect Jesus and love Jesus, but most of them have never thought about the teaching of Jesus, what he was saying in the first century Palestine when Jews were occupied by Rome and had the reaction to Rome made them too rigid on certain issues, and zealots was on the one hand, and there were Herodians, so these two extremes. Jesus was offering an interesting third way. So that's kind of my message. That is interesting, I think, for Muslims, and I've got pretty positive responses to that as well. Newspapers in Pakistan quoted my article in the New York Times about that, a Kashmiri newspaper and a Pakistan newspaper too. And I got an invitation to speak to a Muslim group in Malaysia recently. So I think in the Muslim world, there are all kinds of people. There are people who are rigid. There are people who think we know everything, we don't need any information. There are people who see, well, we obviously have a lot of problems, we need new ideas, so let's be open to. So you have all those people. Reception has been good. I mean, sorry? Christians are wonderful. Well, I mean, yes, I mean, very positive. This is I think, second time I'm speaking at a church. The other one was in Chicago, north of Chicago. And that was a Presbyterian church, as I understand. This is Eastern Orthodox. This is Episcopal Church, and I got some blurbs from some Christian authorities as well, like the Archdeacon to the Ecumenical Patriarch in Istanbul wrote a very powerful blurb. And Eastern Christians were also impressed by the fact that I'm referring to some Eastern Gospels that they know, but other Christians don't know. I say, yeah, we know this. This is in our tradition. There is an Armenian infancy gospel, for example, that I referred to, and it was interesting for some Armenian readers. Yeah, this is maybe the answer. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
That the Prophet Muhammad has actually
Yes, that's true. I will, yes.
Short of what you're saying, because if Mohammed accepted a Christian as his wife, there was a lot more transference of ideas and acceptance than there is in some sects of Christianity and Islam.
Yes, Prophet Muhammad married a Christian wife, and that was also a political alliance as well. I mean, some of his marriages had a diplomatic meaning. At the time, marriages had some diplomatic meanings as well. But that is known in the Islamic tradition, and from that comes the Islamic teaching in Sharia, in Islamic law, that a Muslim man can marry a Christian or a Jew, but not an atheist. So Jews and Christians yes, you can marry them, but not pagans or atheists. And if you marry a Christian wife, she has the right to go to church regularly, and Muslim man should not try to stop her at all from going to the church. So she has the right to remain a Christian. It's in mainstream Islamic law. Culturally still, many Muslims would, stay away from that, but it is allowed in Islamic law. The other way around was not allowed, historically. Muslim woman marrying a non-Christian man was not allowed, although the Quran doesn't explicitly ban that, but it wasn't allowed. And I think it's partly because of the idea that man is dominant to become a Muslim as she wanted, but it was assumed that, a Christian wife or Jewish wife can remain as such, and Muslim men can marry them. So it's a powerful element in Islamic tradition. And also, of course, Jews and Christians were given the right to worship, and practice their faith. Today, you might be hearing that the horrible group called the Islamic State, so-called, they are destroying Christianity. They are wiping out Christians, they're attacking churches. This is barbarism in the name of my faith, and it's so extreme. Of course, it is horrible. I condemn it with all my heart. But we should remember that these churches were there until this point, since the beginning of Islam in the Middle East. Mosul Christians are now being wiped out by ISIS. They were there until just a few years ago, in the past 14 centuries, because in Islamic law, it's accepted that Christians and Jews can practice their faith. So there is this kind of latter-day zealotry that's going on, which is actually overshadowing a lot of positive heritage that we have in Islam. Yes, someone is, you're welcome. Yes, ma'am, then. Yes. Holy Spirit. Is there a notion of Holy Spirit in the Quran? Yes, the Quran has a notion of Holy Spirit, Ruhul Qudus, as in Arabic, but it is Angel Gabriel in Islamic understanding. So the Spirit of God is Angel Gabriel, and he's coming and giving revelations. So he came to Mary, and in the Annunciation, he came to Prophet Muhammad to give him revelation. So although the concept of Holy Spirit is there in the Quran, it is not exactly fitting, the third person of the Trinity in the Christian understanding. Yes, yes, sir.
How should, or what could we Christians learn from Muhammad? You talked about what Muslims could learn from Jesus' way. What could we Christians learn from Muhammad, and how should we view him?
That's a great question. I'm trying, what Christians can learn from Prophet Muhammad. First of all, Prophet Muhammad is a figure very much like Moses. It is no accident, I think, the Quran speaks of Moses very in detail, because he's the kind of model for Prophet Muhammad. Why I'm saying this? Prophet Muhammad is not a holy being. He's not the Word of God, normal life. He was a very virtuous man. He was known as the trustworthy one. So he was a respected man as an honest merchant, but he was a merchant. Only at the age of 40, he had a revelation in a cave. And actually, he couldn't believe. He thought he was crazy. He thought, jinns or evil spirits haunted him. So he he couldn't believe he was a prophet, and he didn't know what it was. And a new revelation later came and said, you are not crazy. This is revelation. God is talking to you. So, therefore, I think one thing I see in him is humility. Like, I've seen so many religious charlatans in my life, and they all come with the belief that God is speaking through me, and I've discovered this. How do you know? Like, who are you? How does that authority come to you? Prophet Muhammad, although he was God's chosen prophet, he was not sure about it. He was afraid. He didn't know what to do. There are parts of the Quran that criticize him and correct his mistakes. He's afraid, and the Quran says, don't be afraid, be brave, go and declare. So he's a humble human being, tried to do his best for this, unexpected mission in his life, at the age of 40, killed and tortured because they believed in one God rather than monotheists. And he saw Christians as allies. He told his followers to go to Ethiopia, find safe haven there. They went to Ethiopia and found safe haven there. But he wouldn't know what's going to happen to him. There's one verse in the Quran, and Prophet Muhammad says, I don't know what's going to happen to me. So he didn't have foresight about the future. And I think that humble human being did everything he could to lead that community. Then he had to fight wars, battles. He didn't want them. I mean, he didn't come out. Some people think he was just a warrior. He was just trying to make his community survive from pagan persecution. They went to another city. In that other city, they were attacked again in Medina. They had to defend themselves, so they took up arms to defend themselves. And there's a verse in the Quran which says, since you are attacked, now you can defend yourself. And they started. So he just got into a journey about which he didn't know, he didn't expect, but he tried to fulfill it as much as he could. And in that kind of, I see that in Moses too. I mean, Moses was afraid of the burning bush. He didn't know, he was scared. I mean, he's a normal human being. And that humbleness, but that obedience to God. I mean, he was scared, but he still did it. And I think that humanity is very much powerful, in Prophet Muhammad's life. And there's so many episodes about it. I don't know, does this answer your question? I mean, there are many things about his compassion. There are many moral lessons as well. But what strikes me in his life is this kind of, he was a humble, modest human being, tried to carry a mission much bigger than himself. And he did, he tried. And he failed sometimes, and he was taken up again by God and said, go, do it again. Thank you. How should we understand Sharia law? Exactly like halakha in Judaism. Sharia means the path. It means just the way Muslims should follow. And parts of Sharia are about personal obedience, personal observance. Like, I fast in Ramadan because that's Sharia. Muslim women wear a headscarf typically. It's not very clear in the Quran, but that's the common interpretation. They do it, they follow the Sharia, they follow law. I don't eat pork, I follow the Sharia. Just like, a halakha observant Jew would not eat pork, or we Muslim men have circumcision, that's in the Sharia, as exactly it's in the halakha. So part of Sharia is about observance, religious ritual, and there's no problem with that. Muslims should be able to not eat pork and wear a headscarf and do their practice freely wherever they are. Even a headscarf is not necessary. Some people think you should actually be very conservative and hide the face. There are different interpretations. I would say, okay, I respect what is yours. But there becomes a problem, I admit that, when Sharia means a legal system, a political system, when it becomes the law of the land. Because there are aspects in Sharia that are not in full, harmony with human rights as we understand them in the modern world. They're corporal punishments. There's one punishment about apostasy. Apostasy is seen as a crime punishable by death. So there are aspects of the Sharia that are concerning from a liberal, democratic human rights point of view. And I accept that point of view, by the way. But however, the way out for me is not to condemn the Sharia, but to look into it, to interpret it, to reinterpret it. And my way of doing that is to look at the context of the Sharia. Because every law has a context, and in that context it generally makes sense, but if you take it out to a different context, it becomes something very problematic. One example, there are corporal punishments in Sharia. Flogging, chopping of hands. These are pretty harsh, ways of punishing crime in our day and age. No prisons. It was a desert society. People were living in tents. You couldn't imprison a person by building a brick wall and feeding him, and you outside waiting under the sun, and he's getting free food and living in the most luxurious place ever built, like a brick house in the middle of the Arabian desert. Nobody prisoned each other, so corporal punishment was the norm in 7th century Arabia, as it was the norm in British common law before the modern era. So for me, Sharia has corporal punishments because that was times, and that was the center of time. I would take the principle there, like theft is a crime and should be punished, but I wouldn't think, it should be through chopping of hands. It can be prison sentences today. And the Ottoman Empire, for example, Ottoman Islamic scholars made these adaptations over time, and they replaced some corporal punishment with prison sentences because they thought that Sharia is flexible. So there's one flexible understanding of Sharia, especially on social legal matters, that it should adopt, it should be reinterpreted. On apostasy, for example, which is a very troubling issue, like Islam doesn't allow apostasy, which means I can't leave Islam and choose another religion. If I do, I'll be a criminal, I'll be punished by capital punishment, as they do in Saudi Arabia. That is a huge problem. That's why I have a chapter in the other book that I have titled Freedom from Islam. You see that according to the whole punishment or apostasy is not in the Quran, by the way. The Quran is silent on most of these issues, but Islamic scholars developed Sharia schools in Middle Ages. When you look into medieval era, you would see that an apostate was somebody who left the Muslims and joined the enemy army. It was in a war context. So it was high treason, as we would call today. And today, armies still do not tolerate high treason. But if you don't understand that context, and if you try to implement it today, you end up violating religious freedom. So my answer to the question is that if Sharia is about personal observance, it's fine. Muslims can do that. I do that as a Muslim. And every practicing Muslim does some part of it a little bit. At least you don't eat pork, you do something that makes you a Sharia-abiding Muslim. But if Sharia will become a legal code, then there are problems. But let me tell you, if you go literally on the halakha, you would have a lot of problems too. Stoning, where is it coming from? It's coming from the Old Testament. Halakha had a penal code as well, and that was pretty harsh too. But Jews stopped implementing it ages ago, and Jews just kept the traditional observance, community observance, and I think that's what Muslims should do. Some of us are already. Does it answer your question, sir? Just too complicated. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Are your viewpoints and the viewpoints of the authors that you mentioned taking root, gathering steam? Is there some momentum to this that would create a movement that would bring us to a new place?
Are these ideas being spread and accepted by Muslims? Again, the answer would be, it depends from country to country, from community to community. My ideas about reform and reinterpretation in Islam is actually more in my first book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. And the idea is there that Islam should not be coerced, it should be based on liberty, personal choice, and freedom, not imposition, and Sharia should be understood, not literally and with principles. So, are these acceptable to Muslims? Well, in Istanbul, yes. To a lot of Muslims, it's acceptable. In Kabul, not exactly, and it depends. And in Saudi Arabia, it is not. It's against the law. Whereas you go to Tunisia, they're making pretty good progress, and they have these progressive ideas. The top Islamic scholar in Tunisia, Rashid Ghannouchi, already makes some of these arguments, and he has helped Tunisia to become a real democracy in the past few years, at least an evolving democracy, let's say. So it is a diverse scene, and I always sometimes need to recall the fact that Christianity was not a very liberal religion for a while. There was the Inquisition and heretics and burned them at the stake and all that. And it took a while to get rid of that. And it came through thinkers like John Locke and, Enlightenment and human rights. And a lot of, even in the 20th century, a lot of reform has taken place within Catholicism, for example. Before Vatican II, Catholics were more rigid on many issues. And I mean, in the Islamic world, we are still a few centuries behind in some parts, but it's a similar battle. How do you deal with faith and freedom and diversity, and how do you defend faith without being coercive and without, by accepting people's choices and all that? Yes, sir.
Why is it that there's so much more violence out of the Islamic world in the Middle East as opposed to a place like Indonesia? Indonesia has a lot more Muslims, I think, than the Middle East, I'm not sure. Why is this so much Middle Eastern?
Very good question. Why is there so much violence in the Middle East, not in Indonesia? Indonesia is indeed the world's biggest Muslim population as a single country. Indonesia is the most 177 million people, if I'm not wrong. That is Indonesia. Malaysia is pretty also impressive too as a Muslim majority country, 55% Muslim, let's say. So, I mean, Islam is not just about the Middle East or the Arab world. And actually, Arabs make 1/5 of all Muslims. So it's in Central Asia and so on. You have many Muslim societies. The Arab world has a particular problem in the 20th century. It's true. Again, there are bright spots. We shouldn't think Morocco or Tunisia are bad countries. I mean, there are some bright spots too, but especially Arab world. Well, that is a huge topic, and I think there are several answers. One is, which looks like a blessing, but it's a curse, oil. Oil brought colonizers, brought wars over power. It helped despotic states to finance themselves and, continue their oppression. It didn't allow real economies to grow up. It just created these clientelistic economies. A lot of conflict, Arab-Israeli conflict. There are a lot of political conflicts in the Middle East, which, created shockwaves and went on and on. That is one thing. The other thing is that, there are certain interpretations of Islam that are particularly troubling, and especially Saudi Arabia is the hotbed of those. The Saudi understanding of Islam, which we strain in the Sunni world, it is like ultra-Orthodox Judaism compared to modern Orthodox Judaism, if you want to compare with other Sunnis. It is the most rigid, close to interpretation. And the drama is that until the 20th century, the Wahhabi strain in Saudi Arabia was just not an important thing. It was just in the desert. Who would know about it? But in the 20th century, the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia discovered they're sitting on the world's most wealthy oil reserves, and God gave this to spread our faith to all corners of the world. So open those madrasas, all corners of the world, and spread that. So here's another element. Western foreign policy sometimes has been destructive. I mean, Western governments sometimes supported dictators for stability, but those dictators were brutal on their people, and the anger against those dictators ultimately turned against the West as well. So that's a lesson. Sometimes still some Western governments have not taken, in my view. And there's just some parts of the world in some areas are just violent. I mean, remember Latin America. It's doing better now. But in the 80s and 90s, there was juntas and guerrillas and contras. And is it because they're Christian? Is it because of Catholicism? They happened to be Catholics, but it was because of other dynamics. So I think the Middle East is within this poisonous dynamic, and there are political roots to it. There are that are disturbing sectarian tensions and so on and so forth. But it is not simply a problem of Islam. It's a problem of a combination of a lot of issues and some troubling interpretations of Islam. You're welcome. You already asked a question, sir? Maybe this gentleman didn't ask, sir. Let's just, not to be unfair. Oh, yes. That there.
Okay, so I want to know, when was the Quran created? Who created it? And did they follow the writings of the disciples? When did the Quran actually come into existence and follow?
Okay, when was the Quran created? That's a very theologically loaded question. Muslims actually fought in the Middle Ages on whether the Quran is created in the first place or not. because some Muslims thought that the Quran is not created. It was with God since eternity, that it came down to earth, to be liberated. Like Jesus, the Word of God became flesh in Jesus, the Quran became a text, but it was before that, it was since with eternity with God. That's a theological position that I don't agree with, by the way. Quran is the Word of God spoken at a certain point in time. That's the other school of thought. But if you're asking the text of the Quran we currently have today, well, it was written down during the time of Prophet Muhammad in different pieces because it was a continuing revelation. So a new verse would come and they would write it somewhere and they would memorize it. Okay, so where is the Quran? What's the book? So they put it down and made it one copy. And other parts of, written down, they were burned to make it, this is one official copy. And that copy was then copied again. So we have the copy from Osman, which is like 20 years after Prophet Muhammad. So that is the original copy. And there's not much dispute about it. Generally, Muslims agree on the text of the Quran. There are just tiny disputes about whether that letter was exactly written like that, or was there a dot on it, or just a little sign, because there's signs in Arabic to read on the upper and lower parts of the letters. But generally, the text of the Quran is accepted. And in our understanding, the Quran is a book that is not in our understanding, just objectively speaking, the Quran is not a book that is speaking about Prophet Muhammad. It's a book that is speaking to him. So that's why when you read the Quran, you learn nothing about Prophet Muhammad. Who was he? I mean, where's the story? Where he was born? You know nothing. It is messages coming to him, and they're written down, and sometimes in not chronological order. So the Quran is speaking to an event, and you have to know what that event was. So they developed an Islamic tradition explaining the context of the verses and so on and so forth. So therefore, sometimes it would help to read the Quran with all this, decade of Islam, I should say. So there's not much dispute about the origin of it. But whether it's a divine origin or not, that's a matter of faith, of course. Oh, disciples. Was it influenced, you mean, by Christian texts? Well, again, that's a theological, it depends where you're looking from. I think from a Christian perspective, you can say, oh, some parts are very similar to Gospel of Luke, so it must have made its way into the Quran. Whereas a Muslim would say, God, who gave Luke that wisdom, gave us the Quran as well. So that's why they are compatible. And there were Christian communities in the time of Prophet Muhammad and Jewish communities as well. So there was some conversation with those too. But the Muslim idea is that Prophet Muhammad didn't know much about all these things. He was not even literate. He was not a theologian. He was a merchant. Then he found these revelations. The revelations came to him from Angel Gabriel. And there's the lady that I avoided for a long time, and that's my mistake. I'm sorry. Please go ahead, ma'am. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am, for a very important point. I would cut my head rather than calling Jesus a liar or anything negative. I would believe in everything Jesus. The Muslim take on this would be to respect, of course, Christian theology, and then therefore to say, I wouldn't be in this choice of thinking Jesus was lying or he was God. I would say, well, maybe he didn't mean that way, but it was, it's interpreted differently. We disagree with the interpretation of that text through Christians, or even doubt some authenticity of parts of the maybe New Testament. So a typical Muslim answer would be, we would believe in everything Jesus would say, but we're not sure exactly he said it that way. So that would be the Muslim. Honestly, I'm not sure about everything I hear in the name of Prophet Muhammad. there are hadiths, sayings attributed to Prophet Muhammad. I say this regarding the New Testament, but we wouldn't be denying or rejecting anything Jesus said. We would be just disagreeing on whether Jesus exactly said this or whether that actually expression exactly means that. And I think also we should remind that Christians read the same New Testament, but even there emerge different theologies and with lower Christology. So I personally agree with the four Gospels. I have some issues with some letters of Paul, I should say. I love the letter of James, on the other hand, I should say, another aspect of the discussion. But this doesn't make me lose my respect to Christianity or see Christianity as a totally alien tradition. I see a lot of things that are similar. And I say, okay, we are monotheists walking slightly different paths, but we are still Abrahamic monotheists. And in that there is I think, magnanimity that connects us. Seeding, whereas I'm of the opinion that Islam is just calling pagans that have not been introduced to monotheism before to Islam. But there are verses in the Quran. There's a verse in the Quran which says, let the people of the gospel judge by what God has revealed in it. I mean, it's not saying Christians should become Muslims. It's calling on Christians to follow their tradition, and it's saying the same thing to Jews as well. So I would say Islam was a historic expansion of Abrahamic monotheism to peoples who were not monotheistic before, like my grandfather somewhere, I mean, in Central Asia. But I mean, when you read the Quran, you see that it actually says Jews and Christians can stay there as Jews and Christians and they will be saved. It is in the Quran. Although Muslim jurisprudence and theology somehow got around with those because they thought if you say Islam is not exclusive, so maybe we're not doing a good job here. So I think that consideration made Muslims a bit more exclusive in their understanding of salvation. But there are various verses in the Quran actually that goes against that, and that shows a kind of religious pluralism. All is in my book, which is right there if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much,
Really,
Mustafa. You are a friend of St. John's Cathedral, and we are proud to call you our friend. A special word of thanks to the Tattered Cover for making copies of Mustafa's books available for sale tonight. And they are out in Memorial Hall, the 2 volumes. And unfortunately, we're not able to take electronic payments tonight. We can take checks or cash, and we don't have any change. So, welcome to 1956. What? Welcome to the year 1956. We couldn't take electronic payments then either. But I hope that you will, if you're able, read his books and kind of come to an appreciation of what he's trying to accomplish here to foster understanding and reconciliation among these great, great world religions. And thank all of you for being here. Thanks to the Abrahamic Initiative. Come back again. Good night.